Hello language learners! Today I want to talk about language learning motivation and why we lose it. I mean, there's so much information on the internet about how to gain back motivation, and I feel like why we lose motivation is a really important thing that a lot of people don't talk about because, just like any kind of problem, how would you expect to be able to solve the problem of losing your language learning motivation if you don't know why it is that you lost it? Now, there's plenty of information on the internet for how to gain back language learning motivation, including, like I said in my video about advice to ignore, link below in the description for that. One piece of advice is to just push forward. Don't do that. Don't just ignore your problems. I believe that in order to accurately solve the problem of lack of language learning motivation, we have to understand why it is that we lost it. So in this video, I'm going to talk about a few really common reasons that language learners lose language learning motivation. And some of these are inevitable. The first ones I'm going to talk about are inevitable. Everybody deals with it sometimes. It's just how you respond to it. Some of these other things, though, they're not necessarily inevitable, but I see them a lot. And these reasons are why a lot of information on the web just isn't helpful because they don't respond to the actual problem. Once we understand why it is that we lost our motivation, then we can figure out how to actually get that motivation back and avoid losing it again in the future. We all start off on our language learning journeys, no matter what the language, with amazing motivation, inspiration. I'm gonna learn this language, I'm gonna be fluent in this language, I'm gonna do it. What happens? The first thing that happens, which is incredibly inevitable, is that we have that flame of motivation that we have that first day, that first couple of days, and it just goes away. That's it. There's no real, explanation or really, analytical reason behind it. It's just that's what motivation does. It ebbs and flows, especially when you start on a new thing. It is so motivating, especially for us creative types. It is so motivating to start on a project, but it's not motivating at all to keep working on the project. So the first thing that happens is that we just lose that initial motivation for no other reason except that that is the nature of motivation. The second reason that is completely inevitable, and it happens to every single language learner in the world, is that it stops being easy. When we start learning languages, when we have a brand new language in front of us and we start learning the very, very basic stuff to express ourselves in basic sentences and statements, it is really easy to learn new things all the time and feel that sense of accomplishment by learning new things. When you learn new things all the time, that really helps propel that motivation forward. Once you start getting more advanced though, and obstacles are a little bit more difficult and you can't really understand new things instantly, it takes you a second to figure them out. Once that starts happening, that's when motivation starts burning out, that initial motivation. That is inevitable. It's always much harder to learn a new language when you haven't just started anymore and things are starting to get a little bit difficult and you really have to push yourself through to the end of that obstacle and push yourself through and figure out what it is that you need to do to keep working forward, even if you don't get that quick win all the time. Like I said, those two first reasons are inevitable and everybody experiences them and everybody's aware of them. The rest of the reasons in this video are things that I'm not sure that everybody is necessarily aware of, and I think a lot more of us experience these than we think. The third reason that we lose language learning motivation is that we keep getting knocked off track. We can't stick to our language learning routine for a variety of different reasons. That could be that, something came up in life and we're just too busy. It could mean that we expect too much of ourselves and we find out that it's really, really not reasonable to expect ourselves to study for an hour every single day. Or every time that we go to study, go to practice, go to learn, we're really critical of ourselves, and that gives us a lot of negative reinforcement that causes us to not want to keep learning anymore and kill that motivation. All of those 3 points, that life keeps happening, that we expect too much of ourselves, and that we're really critical of ourselves, those all fall under the umbrella of we can't stick to our language learning routine. Because, what happens when we can't stick to a routine? What happens when we, come up with some sort of routine for ourselves, doing, watching a YouTube video every other day or whatever your routine looks like? What happens when we just can't do it and we find ourselves, not being able to accomplish the thing that we set out to and not being able to fulfill our commitments? That makes us feel bad. We get really critical of ourselves. We feel really guilty and we think, what's wrong with me? why can't I do this thing that I set out to do? And it becomes a whole lot of negative self-talk. With that negative self-talk, it kills all motivation. It kills anything positive and exciting. And so when those things happen, we lose our motivation, and it can be really hard to get it back, not because it's such a difficult problem per se, but because we're not really aware of it. You know, when that happens, we go looking up YouTube, how to get your language learning motivation back, how to keep motivation. And sure, the advice is good, but it doesn't really help you understand why you lost your motivation, which is a really important piece of the puzzle. Now, the next reason that we lose motivation, a lot of times this happens after that past reason that we can't stick to our routines, and sometimes that happens completely independently. And this next reason is that we don't think that we can. We come up with all these reasons why we can't learn a language, whether it's we don't have a great strategy, we don't have the best resources, we don't have enough time, we don't have the best strategy that's been validated by some well-known polyglot. We come up with these reasons why we can't. So again, when we're constantly talking to ourselves so negatively about what it is that we're doing or not doing to learn our language, that motivation is gone. We lose it. We're not excited to learn anymore. Instead, we're basically constantly telling ourselves reasons why we can't, and we're like really mean to ourselves. Unfortunately, a lot of us have been raised and grew up to criticize ourselves really easily when we don't do things perfectly. We don't exceed expectations, whether the expectations are of you on yourself or of somebody else on the internet. And instead of being really accepting of our flaws as human beings, we criticize ourselves and we talk ourselves down. And when that happens, there is no room for motivation, because as soon as that motivation comes up, you squash it. There's no room for us to tell ourselves that we enjoy language learning and we really want to keep, you know, being involved in language and using the language and learning more about it. There's no room for that when we're busy telling ourselves how much of a failure we are, how we should feel guilty, how we're not good enough, all these really negative messages that we tell ourselves. And the final big reason why we lose our language learning motivation is that we get burned out. Now, this can happen in one of two ways. The first way is the obvious. We get burned out by pushing ourselves too hard, by talking to ourselves negatively for, too long, by throwing ourselves into material that's too advanced, to having expectations that are too high. These all fulfill like the basic idea of burning out. You're doing too much, too fast, not giving yourself enough room to breathe, not giving yourself a break, yada, yada, yada. Everybody knows the basic idea of burnout. The other way that we burn out as language learners is getting burned out by the internet, getting burned out by the sheer amount of knowledge that is available to us. The sheer amount of different strategies and different perspectives and different experiences, taking all this information and not knowing where to go, not knowing how to use it, not knowing which information to take, which information not to take. And then when we do act on some of these strategies and some of this information and we do use them, when they don't work for us, we think it's our fault. And we assume that there's something wrong with us because this here polyglot loves to learn a language using this method, and they've learned 25 different languages using this method. So if I can't use this method to learn a language, what's wrong with me? When we go to find information online and go to different people for advice and we don't know how to use that information to our benefit, we get burned out because we go down all these different pathways using all these different strategies that don't work for us. And so instead of being able to love language learning and maintaining a healthy level of motivation for our language learning over time, we again get really frustrated, we get really upset, we get really down on ourselves, and we keep going in all these different directions, trying all these different theories, experimenting with all these strategies, all these apps, all these books, trying desperately to find the path that'll work for us, and we never can. I mean, there's so much information out there. We have the opportunity to try all this information and it doesn't work for us because not everything is gonna work for us. No wonder we get burned out. No wonder we lose motivation. When we try all these different ways to learn our language and accomplish our goals, and none of them work, and we look back and think about all the time and money and energy that we've spent trying all these different strategies and not feeling like any of them has worked, no wonder we lose our motivation. No wonder, you know, we get down on ourselves and think there's something wrong with us and constantly criticize every little thing that we do. It only makes sense, right? And so when we lose that motivation, it becomes such like a deep problem in our brains, and we go online and we go the same route of trying all these different strategies and methods to get our motivation back. We try to use a one-size-fits-all approach to a situation that's really personal and really individual. We try to get our motivation back by doing the same thing that caused us to lose our motivation in the first place, so it doesn't work. All that aside, I like to say that motivation is a tool that we use before we get to consistency. Now, this means that motivation is pretty temporary, which it is, and consistency is a longer term thing, but it's not something that happens immediately. It takes some work to get there. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as we lose our motivation, we should be depending on our consistency. That's not really true, because, you know, if we don't have motivation at all, like we have the opposite of motivation, whatever the opposite of motivation is, I don't know what that word is. If we have the opposite of motivation, we're not going to be able to be consistent because we're not going to want to be consistent. So the idea is that we don't necessarily need to have the huge, giant, mountain-sized motivation that we have when we start a language. We don't need to have that the whole way through. That's not necessary. However, it is important that we enjoy the language and we want to keep learning the language, and we have a really positive relationship with our language. And that's where motivation does come in. While we shouldn't depend completely on motivation to keep our language learning going, it is an important part of it. And when we lose that motivation, it's really important that we understand why we lost that motivation in order to figure out how to get it back. That is all I have for this video. In the comment section below, let me know, how do you feel motivated about learning languages, and which one of these points really stood out to you? Most of these points I got from talking to struggling language learners and understanding the complex reason why they're struggling with motivation. So this isn't really something that they just told me. This is something that I had to help them figure out for themselves. So let me know which one of these points stuck out to you the most. Otherwise, make sure you hit that subscribe button for new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.